The Third Crusade, launched in the late 12th century, is remembered as one of the most dramatic and violent episodes in the history of medieval warfare. At the heart of this conflict was a struggle for control over the Holy Land, particularly Jerusalem, which had fallen into the hands of Saladin in 1187. Among the pivotal moments of this crusade was the Siege of Acre, a coastal city in modern-day Israel whose capture would prove critical for both the Crusader forces and Saladin's defenders. Understanding the significance of this siege requires examining the political and military landscape of the time, the strategic importance of Acre, and the circumstances that set the stage for one of the most notorious massacres in Crusader history. Acre had long been a vital port city, serving as a commercial hub and a gateway to the Levant. Its walls were fortified, and its defenders were seasoned warriors loyal to Saladin. For the Crusaders, gaining control of Acre was not merely about securing a port, it was about establishing a foothold that would allow them to move inland, resupply, and consolidate power in the region. Without Acre, any attempt to march toward Jerusalem or challenge Saladin's forces would have been perilous at best. For Richard the Lionheart, who arrived in the Holy Land with the reputation of a brilliant and fearless military leader, the city represented both a strategic prize and a testing ground for his leadership. The siege itself was an extraordinary undertaking. European forces, including those led by Richard and Philip II of France, faced immense logistical challenges. Crusaders came from various kingdoms, each with its own military traditions, languages, and internal rivalries. Coordinating such a diverse coalition required careful diplomacy and an iron hand to maintain unity. Supplies were constantly an issue, as the Crusaders relied on maritime routes and long overland convoys to sustain their armies. Disease was another relentless threat. Crowded camps outside the city walls were breeding grounds for illness, and outbreaks could decimate units faster than enemy archers or swordsmen. Yet despite these hardships, the Crusaders remained determined, knowing that the capture of Acre could tilt the balance of power in the region. Richard the Lionheart's approach to the siege was marked by a combination of strategic ingenuity and ruthless determination. Understanding the importance of cutting off the city from reinforcements, he and his fellow commanders implemented a naval blockade that prevented supplies from reaching Acre by sea. On land, trenches, siege towers, and trebuchets were employed to breach the city's formidable walls. The Crusaders also sought to exploit divisions among Acre's defenders, attempting to negotiate with factions within the city to encourage surrender. Yet Saladin's forces, aware of the stakes, resisted fiercely, inflicting casualties and demonstrating that the capture of Acre would not be an easy victory. The human dimension of the siege cannot be overlooked. Both sides endured extreme hardships. Crusaders faced hunger, exhaustion, and exposure to the elements, while the city's residents and defenders suffered from starvation and constant bombardment. Stories from contemporary chroniclers describe the horror of civilians trapped within the walls, witnessing their homes and marketplaces destroyed and fearing the consequences of eventual defeat. The psychological pressure on both sides was immense. For Richard, maintaining morale among his men while simultaneously demonstrating strength to both allies and enemies was a delicate balancing act. Negotiation played a role alongside brute force. At various points during the siege, overtures were made to the defenders of Acre. Richard and other Crusader leaders offered terms of surrender, which often included promises of safe passage or ransom for prisoners. However, these negotiations were fraught with mistrust. Saladin, while known for his chivalry and magnanimity, had his own strategic considerations, and both sides were acutely aware that any perceived weakness could be exploited. The tense standoff created an atmosphere where military action and diplomacy were intertwined, each influencing the other in a complex dance of power and survival. The eventual fall of Acre was a watershed moment. After months of grueling combat and attrition, the city finally succumbed to the Crusaders' relentless assault. The victory was not only a military achievement, but also a psychological blow to Saladin's forces. Acre became a critical supply and staging point for the Crusaders, enabling them to press further into enemy territory. However, the triumph also set the stage for one of the darkest episodes in the siege, the massacre of prisoners, which would stain the legacy of even a celebrated figure like Richard the Lionheart. In retrospect, the Siege of Acre illustrates several broader truths about the Crusades. First, the conflict was not merely a series of battles, but a complex interplay of logistics, diplomacy, and human endurance. The Crusaders' success depended as much on their ability to manage resources and maintain unity as it did on their prowess in combat. Second, the siege underscores the moral ambiguities of medieval warfare. Acts of heroism and strategic brilliance were often accompanied by brutality and acts that shocked contemporary observers. Finally, the Siege of Acre highlights the high stakes involved in the struggle for control of the Holy Land. The city was more than a military objective, it was a symbol of power, faith, and the determination of both sides to achieve dominance at almost any cost. The siege also served as a testament to Richard the Lionheart's military acumen and his complex character. Chroniclers often portray him as both a courageous and ruthless leader, capable of inspiring his troops and making bold tactical decisions. His actions during the siege reveal a man deeply committed to the Crusader cause, but unafraid to employ harsh measures when necessary. This duality would become even more evident in the events following Acre's fall, where the line between strategy and atrocity would blur, forever marking the siege as one of the defining and most controversial episodes of the Third Crusade. Ultimately, the Siege of Acre was not merely a battle for a city, it was a turning point that shaped the trajectory of the Crusades. It demonstrated the potential for both cooperation and conflict among European forces, the resilience and ingenuity required to wage war in hostile territory, and the profound human costs of medieval warfare. As the Crusaders celebrated their victory outside Acre's walls, few could have imagined that the aftermath would lead to a massacre so shocking that even Saladin, a leader renowned for his mercy and honor, would be horrified. The stage was set for a confrontation that would leave a lasting mark on history, highlighting the extremes of courage, cruelty, and the unyielding pursuit of power in an era defined by religious and political conflict. Richard I of England, famously known as Richard the Lionheart, is often remembered as one of the most formidable military leaders of the medieval era. His reputation was forged in the crucible of the Third Crusade, where his charisma, tactical brilliance, and unflinching ruthlessness became legendary. Among his most notable campaigns was the Siege of Acre, a city whose capture was essential for the Crusaders to maintain momentum in the Holy Land. While the siege itself was a monumental undertaking, the methods Richard employed during this campaign reveal a deeper insight into his relentless strategy, a blend of tactical innovation, psychological warfare, and uncompromising decisiveness that would ultimately cement his legacy for better or worse. Richard's approach to warfare was shaped by the realities of his time. Crusader armies were often composed of knights, foot soldiers, mercenaries, and volunteers drawn from across Europe. These forces varied greatly in training, discipline, and loyalty. Coordinating such a heterogeneous army required more than just battlefield skill. It demanded leadership that could inspire unity and enforce obedience. Richard excelled in this domain. His presence on the battlefield was both inspiring and intimidating. Chroniclers of the era describe him riding at the forefront of his troops, often directly engaging the enemy and demonstrating personal courage that set a standard for his men. This display of valor was not merely symbolic. It reinforced authority and fostered cohesion within a diverse and sometimes fractious army. Strategically, Richard understood the importance of leveraging every advantage at his disposal. Siege warfare in the 12th century was a complex art, requiring the integration of engineering, logistics, and timing. At Acre, Richard implemented a multi-pro NGED strategy that combined blockades, direct assaults, and psychological pressure. Recognizing the city's strategic importance as a port and supply center, he immediately sought to cut off all avenues of reinforcement. The Crusaders established a maritime blockade to prevent supplies from reaching Acre by sea, while on land they constructed trenches, towers, and siege engines designed to weaken and eventually breach the city's formidable walls. Each of these actions required meticulous planning, as any lapse could provide the defenders with a critical advantage. Richard also demonstrated a keen understanding of the psychological dimensions of warfare. Siege operations were as much about breaking the will of the enemy as they were about physical conquest. He employed tactics that sought to intimidate Acre's defenders into surrender. For instance, threatening attacks, visible preparations for large-scale assaults, and selective displays of brutality were all intended to erode morale and induce fear. Chroniclers recount how the sight of siege towers, armed with archers and engineers ready to launch projectiles, created an almost palpable sense of dread within the city. Richard's strategy was to make resistance seem both futile and perilous, thereby increasing the likelihood of surrender without incurring unnecessary casualties among his own troops. Negotiation was another tool in Richard's strategic arsenal. Despite his reputation for ruthlessness, he was pragmatic and willing to engage in diplomacy when it served his objectives. At various points during the siege, he offered terms of surrender to Acre's defenders, often proposing exchanges, ransom agreements, or safe passage. These overtures were tactical, rather than purely conciliatory. They served to buy time, gather intelligence, and potentially sow discord among the defenders. Richard understood that a city could fall more easily through negotiation and deception than through prolonged combat, which could sap resources, morale, and manpower. Yet he was equally prepared to abandon diplomacy when it did not serve his purposes, demonstrating a flexibility that made him both respected and feared by allies and enemies alike. Richard's leadership also hinged on meticulous attention to logistics. A prolonged siege required a constant flow of food, weapons, and reinforcements. The Crusaders depended on supply lines stretching from Europe, which were vulnerable to attack and disruption. Richard personally oversaw the distribution of resources, ensuring that his men remained fed and equipped while also preventing hoarding or disorder. His command style combined strict discipline with strategic incentives. Loyal commanders were rewarded, and those who faltered or failed in their duties faced swift consequences. By maintaining operational efficiency, Richard maximized the effectiveness of his forces and ensured that the siege could be sustained over months of grueling conflict. The interplay between strategic innovation and uncompromising brutality defined Richard's conduct at Acre. While he was capable of calculated diplomacy, he did not shy away from using force to achieve objectives, particularly when provoked or when political stakes were high. One of the most controversial aspects of his strategy was his treatment of prisoners. Richard believed that decisive displays of power were necessary to secure both obedience and respect. His approach was rooted in the brutal logic of medieval warfare. Leniency could be perceived as weakness, whereas calculated ruthlessness could deter rebellion and intimidate opponents. This philosophy would later culminate in the infamous massacre of 2,700 prisoners, an act that shocked contemporaries and even drew the ire of Saladin, a commander renowned for his own sense of chivalry. Richard's strategic genius was also evident in his capacity for rapid adaptation. Siege warfare was unpredictable, and conditions could change dramatically based on weather, disease outbreaks, or the arrival of reinforcements. Richard's ability to adjust plans on the fly, redirecting troops, altering assault tactics, or shifting negotiation stances, demonstrated not only intelligence but also a keen understanding of timing. He recognized that seizing initiative and maintaining pressure were essential to victory. Prolonged hesitation could embolden defenders and allow Saladin to mount counterattacks, whereas decisive action created momentum that the Crusaders could exploit. Moreover, Richard leveraged his personal reputation as a psychological weapon. Tales of his fearlessness, prowess in combat, and strict enforcement of discipline spread among both allies and enemies. For his troops, his presence inspired loyalty and courage. For his enemies, it cultivated apprehension and, at times, panic. In the context of Acre, where morale played a critical role in the city's defense, Richard's aura of invincibility and his willingness to exact harsh measures amplified the effectiveness of his military strategy. Yet, Richard's strategy was not without controversy. His focus on decisive action and intimidation often blurred the line between tactical necessity and moral excess. While some historians argue that his actions were standard for the brutal realities of medieval warfare, others contend that his decisions, particularly regarding prisoners, revealed a cold calculation that prioritized victory over ethics. The Siege of Acre thus serves as a lens through which to examine the duality of Richard's leadership: brilliant, courageous, and innovative on one hand, ruthless, fearsome, and morally ambiguous on the other. Ultimately, Richard the Lionheart. RT's strategy at Acre was defined by a combination of military ingenuity, psychological insight, and relentless pursuit of objectives. He coordinated a complex multinational force, implemented innovative siege tactics, maintained logistical stability, and balanced negotiation with intimidation. His leadership demonstrated an acute awareness of both the human and material dimensions of warfare, allowing the Crusaders to sustain pressure on Acre's defenders over an extended period. Yet his approach also foreshadowed the darker consequences of unbridled power, setting the stage for events that would horrify contemporaries and leave a lasting mark on the legacy of the Third Crusade. In conclusion, Richard's relentless strategy was more than a series of military maneuvers. It was a carefully orchestrated combination of tactics, leadership, and psychological warfare designed to achieve maximum effect with calculated efficiency. His approach ensured that Acre fell to the Crusaders and established a base from which they could continue their campaigns. However, it also illustrated the harsh realities of medieval conflict, where the line between strategic brilliance and moral transgression was often perilously thin. Richard the Lionheart's actions during the siege reveal a leader driven by ambition, guided by intellect, and willing to embrace both courage and cruelty to achieve his aims. A complex figure whose legacy continues to fascinate and divide historians to this day. The Siege of Acre, one of the most prolonged and brutal confrontations of the Third Crusade, reached its climax after nearly 2 years of relentless combat. By the time the Crusaders finally breached the city's walls, exhaustion, starvation, and relentless pressure had worn down both the defenders and the besieging forces. Yet even in victory, the capture of Acre was not merely a strategic triumph. It became a dramatic turning point marked by the intertwining of triumph and vengeance, a mixture of celebration, brutality, and shocking cruelty that would leave an indelible mark on the historical record. To understand the full scope of the capture of Acre, it is essential to examine the final stages of the siege, the fall of the city, the immediate actions taken by Richard the Lionheart and his commanders, and the devastating consequences for both defenders and prisoners. By the time Richard arrived with his reinforcements, the Crusaders had already placed Acre under severe strain. Months of constant assault, blockades, and attrition had depleted the defenders' resources and morale. Disease and starvation plagued the city, while the Crusaders had managed to maintain a blockade that prevented reinforcements or resupply. Despite the hardships, the defenders, loyal to Saladin, displayed remarkable resilience. Acre's walls were heavily fortified, its garrison experienced and determined to resist. The final assault required careful coordination, immense courage, and relentless pressure, qualities that Richard would wield with both strategic brilliance and unflinching ruthlessness. The fall of Acre was the result of both siegecraft and decisive action. The Crusaders employed advanced medieval siege engines, trebuchets, mangonels and towers, to breach walls and create entry points. Sappers undermined key fortifications, while archers and crossbowmen provided covering fire to protect advancing infantry. Richard's coordination ensured that multiple assaults occurred simultaneously, stretching the defenders thin and increasing the likelihood of a breakthrough. The sheer intensity of the attacks, combined with the prolonged deprivation faced by those inside, ultimately led to a breach in Acre's defenses. When the gates finally fell, the Crusaders poured into the city, their momentum unstoppable after nearly 2 years of grueling conflict. The immediate aftermath of the capture was both chaotic and deadly. While the Crusaders celebrated a hard-fought victory, the city's defenders and civilians faced the terrifying consequences of their surrender. Chroniclers describe scenes of slaughter, looting, and widespread fear. Richard and his commanders had promised terms of surrender, yet the reality was far more complex. Negotiations had been fraught, misunderstandings and delays had created tensions, and both sides had endured months of harsh conditions. In this volatile environment, decisions made in the heat of triumph could and did have deadly consequences. One of the most infamous aspects of the capture of Acre was the fate of the prisoners. Among those captured were 2,700 Muslim soldiers and civilians who had surrendered under the assumption that they might be ransomed or released. However, Richard's response to the situation was shaped by a combination of anger, strategic calculation, and a desire to assert dominance. Accounts suggest that the massacre was intended as both retribution and a psychological weapon, a demonstration of power designed to intimidate Saladin and deter future resistance. The systematic execution of prisoners, many of whom were bound and marched to predetermined locations before being killed, shocked even contemporaries. The scale and method of the killings, brutal, public, and meticulously carried out, ensured that the event would be remembered as a defining, if horrifying, moment of the Third Crusade. The motivations behind Richard's actions at Acre were complex. On one level, there was a personal element. Frustration over delays in negotiations, perceived dishonor from the defenders, and the immense pressure of maintaining control over a diverse and often fractious Crusader army. On another level, there was a strategic calculation. By demonstrating the consequences of resistance so vividly, Richard aimed to create a psychological deterrent for other cities and armies in the region. In medieval warfare, reputation and fear were as critical as tactical skill. A leader who could instill terror in enemies could achieve objectives with fewer resources and less protracted conflict. Acre became a stark example of this harsh calculus, yet the massacre also provoked immediate diplomatic and ethical consequences. Saladin, known for his relative magnanimity in warfare, was reportedly horrified by the scale and severity of the executions. Letters and contemporary chronicles suggest that the event strained negotiations and created a cycle of vengeance and distrust that would shape the remainder of the crusade. Even within the Crusader camp, reactions were mixed. Some praised Richard for his decisive action, while others questioned the morality and long-term prudence of such extreme measures. The tension between military necessity and moral conduct became a recurring theme in the campaign, highlighting the difficult choices faced by leaders in a period defined by brutal conflict and religious zeal. Beyond the immediate violence, the capture of Acre had significant strategic implications. With the city under Crusader control, supply lines were secured, reinforcements could arrive more efficiently, and a base was established for further campaigns into the interior of the Holy Land. Acre's harbour allowed European powers to maintain a steady flow of ships, soldiers, and provisions, transforming the Crusader position from precarious to dominant. The city became a symbol of both success and the harsh realities of war, where victory often came at an appalling human cost. The capture of Acre also had a profound psychological impact on both sides. For the Crusaders, it was a morale-boosting triumph that validated their sacrifices and reinforced confidence in their leadership, particularly Richard's command. For Saladin and his forces, the fall of the city and the massacre of prisoners were deeply demoralizing, highlighting vulnerabilities in their defensive strategies and underscoring the uncompromising nature of their adversaries. The event intensified the resolve of both sides, setting the stage for further confrontations and shaping the tactical and psychological landscape of the Third Crusade. Importantly, the capture of Acre illustrated the duality of Richard's leadership. The same qualities that made him an effective and brilliant military strategist, courage, decisiveness, and the ability to inspire loyalty, also enabled acts of extraordinary cruelty. His actions demonstrated a pragmatic, if ruthless, understanding of medieval warfare, that victory required both military skill and the willingness to employ fear and brutality when deemed necessary. This duality would continue to define his legacy, shaping perceptions of him both as a heroic figure in European memory and a figure of terror among his adversaries in the Muslim world. In retrospect, the events surrounding the capture of Acre reveal the complexities of warfare in the medieval period. Siege operations were not simply matters of tactics and engineering. They involved intricate calculations of psychology, diplomacy, and human behavior. Richard's ability to navigate these dimensions, to combine strategic foresight with immediate, decisive action, exemplifies the qualities that made him one of the most celebrated military leaders of his era. Yet, the ethical implications of his decisions, particularly the massacre of prisoners, underscore the moral ambiguities inherent in a period marked by religious fervor, political ambition, and the relentless pursuit of power. Ultimately, the capture of Acre was both a remarkable military achievement and a dark testament to the costs of medieval warfare. It demonstrated the power of strategic leadership, the effectiveness of coordinated siege tactics, and the impact of psychological pressure on both defenders and allies. At the same time, it revealed the extremes to which leaders like Richard the Lionheart would go to secure victory, blurring the lines between strategy, vengeance, and atrocity. The fall of Acre thus stands as a defining episode of the Third Crusade, a moment where triumph and brutality collided, creating a legacy that continues to fascinate, horrify, and provoke debate among historians and enthusiasts of medieval history alike. The capture of Acre marked a decisive victory for the Crusaders, yet it was immediately followed by one of the most infamous and brutal events of the Third Crusade, the massacre of 2,700 Muslim prisoners. This act, carried out under the command of Richard the Lionheart, shocked contemporaries and even drew condemnation from Saladin, who was renowned for his chivalry and clemency. The massacre at Acre was not merely a consequence of battlefield chaos. It was a calculated, deliberate, and chilling display of vengeance, intimidation, and strategic ruthlessness. To fully grasp the magnitude of this atrocity, it is essential to explore the events leading up to it, the execution of the massacre itself, the motivations behind Richard's decision, and the immediate and long-term consequences for both the Crusaders and Saladin's forces. Following months of grueling siege warfare, Acre finally fell in July 1191. The Crusaders had endured harsh conditions, disease, and exhaustion, while the defenders inside the city had suffered starvation, bombardment, and relentless assaults. After the fall, negotiations were undertaken to determine the fate of those who had surrendered. Among those captured were approximately 2,700 soldiers and civilians who had laid down their arms under the assumption that they would be ransomed or released. In medieval warfare, it was common for prisoners to be held for ransom or exchanged, particularly when they were of high status. However, the situation in Acre was complicated by political, military, and personal factors that would ultimately make mercy a secondary consideration. Richard's decision to execute the prisoners was driven by a combination of outrage, strategic calculation, and the intense pressures of wartime command. Chroniclers report that he was angered by delays in the payment of agreed ransoms and the protracted negotiations, which he perceived as dishonorable. Months of attrition, loss, and hardship had built a sense of frustration and resentment among the Crusaders, which found a brutal outlet in the massacre. Moreover, Richard believed that a dramatic display of power could serve as a deterrent to other cities considering resistance, demonstrating that defiance against the Crusaders would be met with merciless consequences. This logic, rooted in fear as a tool of war, would guide the execution of the prisoners. The massacre itself was executed with cold, systematic precision. Contemporary accounts describe how the prisoners, numbering in the thousands, were bound and divided into groups before being led to prearranged execution sites outside the city walls. Chroniclers recount that soldiers, acting under Richard's orders, carried out the killings using swords, axes, and other weapons. The executions were public, designed to be seen by both the Crusaders and the remaining defenders in Acre, amplifying the psychological impact of the event. Witnesses described horrifying scenes of mass slaughter, with prisoners killed en masse, often without distinction between soldiers and civilians. The sheer scale of the massacre made it one of the most notorious acts of the Crusades, cementing its place in history as an emblem of wartime brutality. While the massacre was brutal in its execution, it also carried a complex strategic rationale. Richard understood that medieval warfare relied as much on psychological dominance as on battlefield prowess. By instilling terror among Saladin's forces, he aimed to weaken resistance in future encounters, reduce the likelihood of prolonged sieges, and secure a reputation that would force other cities to surrender more readily. In this sense, the massacre was a calculated use of fear as a weapon, a grim but effective extension of his siege strategy at Acre. Yet this logic was accompanied by profound ethical consequences, raising questions about the moral boundaries of leadership and the treatment of prisoners in wartime. The massacre provoked immediate outrage among contemporaries. Saladin, known for his generosity and respect for chivalric conduct, reportedly condemned the killings. In the context of the time, Saladin's response highlighted a significant cultural and moral contrast. Whereas Richard prioritized strategic expediency and retribution, Saladin adhered to a code of honor that valued mercy and humane treatment of captives. Letters and accounts from Muslim chroniclers describe shock and horror at the scale and deliberate nature of the massacre, portraying it as a betrayal of accepted norms of warfare. Even within the Crusader camp, there were murmurs of unease. Some recognized the effectiveness of the act, while others questioned its morality and long-term consequences. The massacre also had a ripple effect on the dynamics of the Third Crusade. While it temporarily demonstrated the power of the Crusaders and showcased Richard's ruthlessness, it also hardened the resolve of Saladin and his allies. The brutality fueled animosity, deepened mistrust, and intensified the cycle of vengeance that characterized the conflict. Subsequent encounters between the Crusaders and Saladin's forces were influenced by the memory of Acre, with both sides aware of the extreme measures the other was capable of taking. The event, in this sense, became a catalyst for further escalation, shaping the psychological and strategic landscape of the Crusade. From a human perspective, the massacre represents the tragic cost of medieval warfare. The 2,700 prisoners were not merely soldiers. They were men, women, and possibly young boys caught in the machinery of conflict. Their deaths were a stark reminder of the dehumanizing effects of war and the extreme measures that leaders like Richard were willing to employ to achieve military objectives. The suffering of these individuals, often overlooked in broad historical narratives, underscores the human toll that accompanied strategic victories and territorial gains. Historians continue to debate Richard's motivations and the morality of his actions at Acre. Some argue that he was operating within the brutal realities of medieval warfare, where swift and ruthless measures were necessary to maintain authority and achieve objectives. Others contend that the massacre represented a deliberate act of cruelty driven by personal anger and a desire to assert dominance in a manner that exceeded the bounds of acceptable conduct even for the time. This duality between pragmatic strategy and moral transgression remains central to understanding Richard the Lionheart's legacy. The massacre at Acre also serves as a case study in the broader consequences of warfare and leadership. It illustrates how victory can be intertwined with atrocity, how strategic objectives can collide with ethical considerations, and how the actions of a single leader can shape perceptions and relations for generations. The event left an enduring mark on the Crusades, influencing subsequent campaigns, diplomacy, and the historiography of Richard's reign. Chroniclers on both sides ensured that the memory of the massacre was preserved, creating a historical record that continues to provoke reflection on the limits of power and the human cost of conquest. In conclusion, the massacre of 2,700 prisoners at Acre stands as one of the most chilling episodes of the Third Crusade. It was a deliberate act of vengeance and intimidation, executed with horrifying efficiency and motivated by a combination of personal anger, strategic calculation, and the pressures of wartime command. The event highlighted Richard the Lionheart's dual nature, brilliant, courageous, and tactically astute, yet capable of extreme cruelty when circumstances demanded. Its immediate impact shocked contemporaries and inflamed relations with Saladin, while its long-term legacy continues to define discussions of medieval warfare, leadership, and morality. The massacre is a stark reminder that even in moments of victory, the human cost of war can be immense, and that strategic brilliance is often inseparable from acts of profound brutality. The massacre of 2,700 prisoners at Acre sent reverberations far beyond the walls of the city, shaking the medieval world both politically and psychologically. While the immediate consequences were felt in the Levant, the shockwaves extended to Europe, the Muslim world, and the broader context of the Crusades, shaping the reputation of Richard the Lionheart and altering the strategies, alliances, and perceptions of leaders on both sides. The event at Acre was not simply a military action, it was a catalyst for political, moral, and cultural repercussions that would influence the trajectory of the Third Crusade and the historical memory of one of its most famous figures. In the Muslim world, the Massacre was received with a combination of horror, outrage, and renewed determination. Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, was a commander celebrated for his chivalry, generosity, and restraint. His own conduct in war, particularly his treatment of Christian prisoners, had earned him respect among both Muslims and Europeans. The scale and brutality of Richard's actions at Acre, therefore, represented a stark and morally jarring contrast. Contemporary chroniclers describe Saladin as deeply disturbed by the massacre, not only because of the immediate loss of life, but also because it violated established norms of warfare, even in a period where violence was common. The event reinforced Saladin's understanding of the Crusaders as ruthless and unyielding foes, prompting him to adopt a more cautious and strategic approach in subsequent engagements. Beyond the battlefield, the massacre influenced the political calculus of the Muslim leadership. Cities and fortresses under Saladin's domain, aware of the Crusaders' capacity for uncompromising brutality, were forced to reconsider their defensive strategies. Some leaders advocated for negotiation or surrender to avoid similar fates, while others called for increased vigilance and the reinforcement of fortifications. The massacre thus had a psychological impact that extended far beyond Acre itself. It instilled both fear and resolve, shaping the decisions of Muslim rulers in ways that would resonate throughout the campaign. In Europe, news of the massacre reached both admiration and criticism. Among Richard's supporters, the event was often framed as a demonstration of decisive leadership and military genius. Chroniclers emphasized his courage, strategic acumen, and ability to inspire and discipline his forces. In this view, the massacre was a necessary, albeit harsh, measure to consolidate Crusader power and achieve objectives in a brutal and unforgiving theater of war. By this logic, Richard's ruthlessness was justified by the extraordinary circumstances of prolonged siege warfare, scarce resources, and the high stakes of the Third Crusade. However, not all reactions in Europe were laudatory. Reports of the massacre stirred unease among some observers who questioned the morality and long-term prudence of such extreme actions. The killing of surrendered prisoners challenged the medieval codes of chivalry and warfare, raising ethical concerns even among those who supported the Crusades. Religious authorities and chroniclers debated the appropriateness of Richard's conduct, highlighting the tension between practical military strategy and moral responsibility. These debates contributed to a nuanced and sometimes ambivalent reputation for Richard in Europe, where he was simultaneously celebrated as a heroic Crusader king and scrutinized for his capacity for cruelty. The massacre also had strategic implications for the Crusaders themselves. While the immediate effect was to instill fear in Saladin's forces and compel compliance from other cities, it also hardened opposition and created a cycle of retaliation. Subsequent encounters between the Crusaders and Muslim forces were influenced by the memory of Acre, with both sides aware of the potential for extreme violence. The massacre thus reshaped the dynamics of conflict, making diplomacy more fraught, reinforcing distrust, and influencing battlefield tactics. Leaders on both sides had to contend not only with the physical threat of combat, but also with the psychological legacy of brutality and vengeance. Culturally, the event at Acre left a lasting imprint on the historical consciousness of both Europe and the Muslim world. In European chronicles, Richard the Lionheart's actions were often depicted through the lens of heroism, courage, and divine mandate, with the darker aspects of the massacre either downplayed or justified as necessary for the success of the crusade. In contrast, Muslim chroniclers emphasized the human cost, the moral transgression, and the shock experienced by communities and leaders in the region. This divergence in narrative reflects the broader clash of perspectives, values, and worldviews that characterized the Crusades, and it illustrates how a single event could be remembered and interpreted in vastly different ways. The massacre at Acre also had implications for the broader politics of the Crusades. It demonstrated the ability of a single decisive act to influence the behavior of other rulers, commanders, and cities. Fear became a tool of power, shaping negotiations, compliance, and resistance. Richard's willingness to employ extreme measures sent a message to both allies and enemies. The Crusaders were formidable, resolute, and capable of ruthless action when necessary. However, this display of power came at the cost of potential alliances, moral authority, and long-term goodwill, highlighting the delicate balance between military expediency and broader strategic consequences. Religiously, the massacre prompted reflection and debate about the ethics of warfare in a period framed by faith and divine justification. The Crusades were imbued with religious significance, and leaders on both sides often justified extreme measures through appeals to God, sacred duty, and moral necessity. Yet the scale of the killings at Acre raised questions about the limits of divine sanction and the ethical responsibilities of Christian and Muslim leaders alike. The event contributed to ongoing discourse on morality in warfare, justice, and the treatment of prisoners, issues that resonated not only during the Crusades, but in the broader development of medieval military and religious thought. The legacy of Acre extended well beyond the immediate military and political consequences. It became a symbol of the extremes of Crusader violence and the capacity for both strategic brilliance and moral transgression in medieval warfare. For historians and modern audiences, the massacre highlights the human cost of ambition, the intersection of power and morality, and the complex character of leaders like Richard the Lionheart. The event reminds us that victories in war are rarely straightforward. They are shaped by a combination of tactical skill, psychological strategy, and, at times, acts of unthinkable cruelty that leave lasting marks on history. Ultimately, the shockwaves from Acre affected both the course of the Third Crusade and the historical memory of the period. Saladin's subsequent campaigns were shaped by caution and renewed strategy, while European perceptions of Richard became layered with admiration, fear, and moral questioning. The massacre underscored the reality that medieval warfare was not only a contest of armies, but also a struggle of reputation, morality, and psychological dominance. It demonstrated that actions taken in moments of victory could resonate far beyond the battlefield, influencing diplomacy, strategy, and historical memory for generations. In conclusion, the massacre of 2,700 prisoners at Acre sent shockwaves across the medieval world, reshaping political, military, and cultural landscapes. It highlighted the moral ambiguities of leadership in a time of war, the psychological dimensions of strategy, and the human cost of conflict. Richard the Lionheart emerged as a complex figure, celebrated for his courage and military brilliance, yet infamous for his capacity for ruthless violence. Saladin's response, the reactions of European chroniclers, and the enduring memory of the event illustrate how a single act could reverberate across continents, leaving a lasting legacy that shaped the course of the Crusades and influenced perceptions of morality, power, and leadership in the medieval world. Acre became more than a city. It became a symbol of the extremes of human ambition, courage, and cruelty, a historical turning point whose reverberations continue to captivate, horrify, and provoke reflection even centuries later.